President Donald Trump, since the beginning of his second term, has been obsessed with uniting all of the Northwestern Hemisphere under the control of the United States. One of the first things he did in office was sign an executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, despite the fact that it's been called the Gulf of Mexico since the 16th century. The planned vision of a united North America under the authority of the United States was tongue-in-cheek called the Donroe Doctrine on January of 2025 in an edition of the New York Post. But the president, like a lot of people who have little to no concept of satire, took it verbatim. The president took it one step further and actually adopted it as his plan several months later into his first year in office. What was now seen as a joke was now coming to reality. Trump coveted the Danish territory of Greenland and has mentioned many times in speeches as well, along with his MAGA underlings. The problem is the United States and Denmark made a deal in 1916 when they bought the claim to the Danish Virgin Islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. Part of the transaction treaty was that the United States would give up on any further attempt to purchase Greenland. Secretary of State Robert Lansing, under President Woodrow Wilson, stated in the treaty with Denmark, agreeing to withdrawing the claim to Greenland by saying, the undersigned Secretary of the United States of America, duly authorized by his government, has the honor to declare that the government of the United States of America will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland. When Germany invaded Denmark in 1940, the United States activated the Monroe Doctrine and used its authority to occupy Greenland, which had been virtually abandoned due to the fall of Denmark. The U.S. Army landed in Greenland and occupied the island, setting up several defensive positions there until the end of the war. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 and the liberation of Denmark, they thought the U.S. Army would leave Greenland, but they had no plans on doing so. In 1946, the Secretary of State, James Burns, under the authority of President Truman, tried to buy Greenland for $100 million. Denmark refused, but signed a treaty with the United States, which allowed them to build military bases on the island and to occupy them for as long as they felt it was necessary for the national defense of the United States. Despite all of this, President Donald Trump has continued to apply pressure on Denmark and the island of Greenland into a forced buyout. But like all of his other ventures, they have gotten nowhere and has made the president look like a doddering man-child of a bully. Despite all of this, he continues to press on because he has never learned how to respond to the answer no. His MAGA underlings in Congress, the first one, Andy Ogles, a congressman from Tennessee, had put forward a bill in Congress called Make Greenland Great Again on January 13, 2025, which authorized the purchase of Greenland from Denmark. A month later, MAGA congressman from Georgia, Buddy Carter, introduced the Red, White, and Blue Land Act of 2025, which would rename Greenland into Red, White, and Blue Land. All talk of annexing Greenland has been pushed to the side as of now that the president attacked Iran on February 28, 2026. This isn't the first time the United States has fooled around with Iran. The history between these two nations and the crisis that has come out of the region due to meddling around with oil and governments will be covered in a future episode. Now let's look at the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was a project started in the early 1900s to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama to allow ships to move from the Caribbean Sea into the Pacific Ocean instead of having to travel around the South American Horn. The idea of a canal to cut the travel time has been proposed since 1513. The United States helped build the canal and gave authority to Panama on December 31st, 1999, after being a U.S. territory since 1914. Another part of this so-called Donroe Doctrine, President Trump has vowed to reclaim Panama Canal after claiming the United States is being charged high rates to use it and claimed China has all but bought the exclusive rights to the canal. The government pressured Hong Kong company C.K. Hutchinson Holdings into selling 8% of its stake in the canal to BlackRock. The deal was later nixed by the government of Panama. But Panama and the United States on April 9, 2025 signed an agreement which would allow American soldiers to be deployed to the Panama Canal zone. as long as the government agrees with it to protect its own interests. Another MAGA congressman, Dusty Johnson from the state of South Dakota, introduced a bill which the United States would be able to buy back the Panama Canal. Another key part of the Donroe Doctrine was to make Canada the 51st state. In 2025, he held meetings with Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and tried to persuade him several times to allow Canada to join the United States. All attempts failed, so Donald Trump decided to weaponize trade with his neighbors by raising the tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%, but it was later reduced to 25%. The Donroe Doctrine was used in the late summer of 2025 when President Trump revived the Big Stick policy towards America's neighbors in the Caribbean when he launched Operation Southern Spear, which involved attacking alleged drug smugglers that were using, allegedly, speedboats and fishing trawlers. Over 150 people have been killed so far in these bombings. A month later in October, President Trump began to accuse President of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, of being an illegal drug dealer and ended diplomatic aid to Colombia. This was after a meeting with Trump in the White House earlier in the year and accepting people being removed by ICE under the threat of a 50% tariff. But on October 24th, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned Petro, along with his wife, son, and Armando Benedetti, by introducing them into a specially designated nationals and block persons list, accusing the group of being involved in the global illicit drug trade. On January 6, 2026, the United States attacked Venezuela and kidnapped their president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. The mission was called Operation Absolute Resolve, under the guise of arresting him for being a drug kingpin. In reality, let's hear from his own words, shall we? Venezuela unilaterally seized and stole American oil, American assets, and American platforms, costing us billions and billions of dollars. They did this a while ago, but we never had a president that did anything about it. They took all of our property. It was our property. We built it. We never had a president that decided to do anything about it. Instead, they fought wars that were 10,000 miles away. We built Venezuelan oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill. And the socialist regime stole it from us during those previous administrations, and they stole it through force. This constituted one of the largest thefts of American property in the history of our country. Venezuela nationalized the oil and gas back in the 70s, and it has been coveted by the Republican Party ever since. The nationalization began in 1976 under President Carlos Andrés Perez, who continued to play ball with the American oil corporations until the arrival of Hugo Chavez in 1999, who didn't want to play ball and try to get a fair market value for the oil, and took an active role in OPEC to make sure it did so. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, continued Hugo Chavez's policy of tying the country's oil production to its economy, but due to the market being flooded with cheap oil and all of the major oil corporations refusing to do business in Venezuela, led to the economy being reduced to shambles and opened the door for being removed by Trump, who has been waiting to do so since his first term, when in 2017 levied heavy sanctions against the country. His later arrest by the U.S. government during Operation Absolute Resolve now opened the door to a more cooperative regime, which is headed by Maduro's vice president, who is more than happy to agree with Trump's demands. Now that the Iran war is underway, the corporations that left Venezuela back in 2017, using the excuse about how low quality the oil that the country produced, are now more than happy to resume production due to the ongoing war in the Middle East and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, all because the United States and the United Kingdom, along with the MI6 and the CIA, acting in the interest of big oil, caused the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, also known as Operation Ajax, which toppled the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, who, like Venezuela, nationalized the country's oil industry. The new government that was installed expanded the powers of the Shah of Iran and installed a puppet figurehead in the government who was a rabid anti-communist. But like I said earlier, that's a story for another day. The illustrious narrator would like to thank you for watching this video. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, like, and tell a friend.